So before we get started with this build, I'd like to remind you guys of a couple things. First, I'd like to remind you of the teamwork strategy for this build, as well as what our Magus is already covering. But if you guys only care about this build, or you've already seen my Magus video, then you're going to want to jump to this timestamp right here. Again, the teamwork strategy for this party is pretty simple. We want to debuff our opponents, buff our allies, protect our allies, and we want to blast the heck out of our enemies. We're also going to need healing options. Our Magus already covers our burst damage, our different damage types, our dex-based skills, our circumstance debuffs, and our action economy manipulation, as well as protecting our more ranged allies. This build will cover our single target DPR, as well as our buffs, and some debuffs. It also covers our intelligence and our wisdom-based recall knowledge. And finally, this build can help protect allies as well. It is a melee build, even though you wouldn't expect it to be a melee build based on the class we're taking. For our ancestry, we did roll Awakened Animal. More specifically, the flying awakened animal. That means, yes, eventually we are going to be able to fly in this build without having to use spell for this fly spell, which is going to come in very handy. For today's class, we'll be going wizard, believe it or not. And our arcane thesis is going to be spell substitution. This will give us a lot more versatility. We can change our spells around by spending 10 minutes, which is a pretty big deal here. That is going to be extremely helpful when we know what spells we're going to need ahead of time. And our arcane school is going to be School of Protean Form. We want to focus on buffing and transforming into other creatures in this build. So, School of Protean Form is perfect for that. We do have a few debuff spells in this build, but we're mostly going to want to focus on those buffs and transforming to help protect the other two builds in this party, which will be ranged. Although, as a flying animal, we will be able to fly out of range of melee enemies and rain down more ranged spells as well. But transforming into things like dragons and animals is going to be our main focus here. For skills, as I said, intelligence-based skills are going to be important here, and that's mostly going to be your recall knowledge. But having crafting in this build is going to be effective because the last two builds in this party are going to rely heavily on items. And having someone in the party that is good at making items is going to be effective. Otherwise, yeah, for skills, pick recall knowledge skills like Society, Arcana, stuff like that. For attributes, since we're focusing on transforming and buffing our allies, our intelligence isn't as important as it would be for other wizard builds. And we won't need strength at all because our damage and our athletics bonus will be coming from our spells that we're using to transform into other creatures. And charisma doesn't factor into this build at all. We will, however, still need a little bit of dexterity, constitution, and wisdom for this build, because we will be using our saving throws when we're in our other forms. So we need those to be at least decently high. Granted, our fortitude save won't be great as a wizard, but we need it to be as high as possible. Okay, so I am going to go over all three of the Ancestry Feats I'm going to be taking for this build right now, because they're mainly just better versions of the same feats. We're going to be taking Take Flight, Strong of Wing, and Full Flight. We have a few spells in our curriculum that are more ranged, so if we take these feats, we can be out of range of our enemies and still cast these spells. And having a fly speed is always great, especially since we don't have to waste a spell on the fly spell for ourselves. We still need to cast fly for our allies if it comes to that, but at least we don't have to cast it on ourselves once we do get that full flight at level 9. Moving on to class feats. We'll be taking Reach Spell. Our buff spells and our debuff spells that are in our curriculum, a lot of them are touch spells, and we don't want to have to be near our targets in order to use them. So Reach Spell gives them a 30-foot range, which is really going to help, especially with those debuff spells that we'll want to use sometimes. But again, we are focusing mostly on transforming and buffing our allies. So we won't use this often, but it will be effective when we do use it. For our level 4 class feat, we're going to be taking Bespell Strikes. When we use a spell to transform, this allows us to do an extra 1d6 force damage. Yeah, transforming may provoke a reaction if we try to do it in front of an enemy, but getting extra damage that first turn that we transform is kind of a big deal. Granted, it's not much more damage, but it will help us with our single target DPR, which is important. At level 6, we are definitely going to need steady spell casting. A lot of times this build is going to require us to cast spells in melee range, which means we are going to take reactions sometimes. And some reactions can disrupt spells, and we don't want that. So this gives us a chance to say, you know what? No, you don't get to disrupt my spell. Granted, it is a DC 15 flat check, which isn't that high of a chance, but at least we have a chance to just automatically transform, even if we do get hit before we can transform into whatever we're going to transform into. For our level 8 feat, we're going to take Advanced School Spell to get the Shifting Form focus spell. Sometimes we're going to want certain aspects of the forms we can transform into without wasting a spell slot actually transforming into the full form. Things like Dark Vision, more speed, climb speed, sense, that sort of thing. So this will allow us to gain those without actually using one of our spell slots. And we'll still be able to talk to our allies and all that. This can be highly effective outside of combat, and even in combat if we want. And the final feat that I'm going to cover in this video is, of course, Quickened Casting. Once per day, just transform for a single action. That's a pretty big deal. We can also use it for other 2-action spells, but our main focus is going to be transformation here. So we're mostly going to want to use this to transform when we really need to, quickly. As that is our main focus in this build, is transforming into other forms. For our spells, we're mostly going to want to focus on buff spells and transformation spells. Unfortunately, buffing is what we're going to have to do with this build, because with the new arcane list, there isn't near as many form spells as I would like. But we can be in melee if we want to, once we get that elemental form spell from our school. Our school spells do have a few debuff spells, but our intelligence is going to be low or lower than it could be, which means we're not going to want to be focusing on those. Remember, we have reach spell and we have a fly speed, which means eventually we're going to be able to fly out of the reach of melee enemies and buff our allies that way, as well as debuff if we want to. We can also be in melee if we want with those transformation spells, which is going to come in very handy for this party. If you've got free archetype, I do have a few suggestions for what you can take for your free archetype. First is Sentinel. This will give you armor, which will allow you to be in melee more easily, even when you're not in one of your forms. The second one I recommended is Witch. Witch can give you a lot of transformation spells from other lists. Primal List comes to mind immediately, and the Divine List does have a few spells that allow you to transform into different forms. Of course, Druid is also an option, as that can allow you to use focus points to transform instead of just spell slots. But if you want to be a full Monster Master, then I highly recommend the Wild Mimic archetype for this build, as you'll be able to use monster abilities that you wouldn't be able to normally use, even when you're not in one of your forms. And that's the build. So, if you guys enjoyed this video, go ahead and leave a like, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment. Let me know how you would do this build. And of course, you can join my social media as well as my Discord server to talk to me and other people about this kind of stuff. And I'm restarting TikTok videos soon, so you guys can catch me on there as well. You can also join my Patreon page if you want a Google Sheet for this build, as well as all my other builds. If you haven't seen my Arcane Grappler Magus build, you can absolutely check it out right here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and remember, teamwork is vital. It helps us solve problems.